All right, so glad to be back for another episode of Faith in Homebuying. And if you've been tracking with me, I've been kind of outlining some, I guess it would be, what is housing discrimination, and actually diving a little bit more into that. I have a lot of people that ask me about, just the industry of home buying and how, in effect, things as far as racial discrimination, stuff like that has actually affected my industry. And so one of the things that I'd like to talk to people about is, and in a little bit, we're going to talk a little bit more about redlining. The last episode, I talked about redlining and its effect, and it was a beautiful book by, let's see here, and the author is Richard Rothstein, The Color of Law, A Forgotten History of How Our Government Segregated America. And it's fascinating, especially in not knowing this type of history, or not knowing the history of how even redlining, began and why it was even created. So we're going to finish that, and I'm going to bring it back a little bit to even home and kind of go through a little bit of a timeline on how our area over here, specifically the Belhaven area and Menlo Park, what they went through throughout these times, and how you could see the roadmap of even that area has changed dramatically from where it was to where it is now. Not by anyone's fault per se. However, it's the natural inclination of things to change, and how different laws that have been passed have then changed the face of different neighborhoods and areas. But before we get into that, I like the word. It's kind of good to go to the word, and everything that's been going on, it's still, I'm thankful that we have grounding like, the Bible and just the teachings of Jesus and how he handled things. And in Luke 6, in particular, Luke 6:27, I was reading that kind of in my devotional, and it just kind of brought a lot of things home, because we have a lot of different opinions on certain things, people feeling a certain way, especially now. But the biggest thing that Jesus even talked about, even as this is a time where he picked his 12 disciples, and he was dealing with the Pharisees about them saying, you can't do this and you can't do that, right? However, the biggest theme that he had on here was love your enemies. And in verse 27, in Luke 6:27, it states, but if you will listen, I say to you, love your enemies and do something wonderful for them in return for their hatred. When someone curses you, bless that person in return. When you are mistreated and harassed by others, accept it as your mission to pray for them. To those who despise you, continue to serve them and minister to them. If someone takes away your coat, give him as a gift your shirt as well. When someone comes to beg from you, give to that person what you have. When things are wrongly taken from you, do not demand they will be given back. However you wish to be treated by others is how you should treat everyone else. And to sum it up in verse 32, are you really showing true love by only loving those who love you back? Even those who don't know God will do that. Are you really showing compassion when you do good deeds only to those who do good deeds to you? Even those who don't know God will do that. And this, I think it just sums up, and just me even trying to keep myself in mind that, however you wish to be treated by others is how you should treat everyone else. If you want it, even more so, to give it back and to return. And I'm focused, and this next season, this next month, this is the first, it's the first part of the month, of July, and so I'm focused that I'm going to have a good month, and I'm going to keep the teachings of Jesus in the forefront of my mind as I navigate things, not only with my family, but with everyone else I'm surrounded that may have a different opinion toward me and towards situations, but still knowing that you need to love everybody and treat them with respect and treat them with kindness. Amen. So that being said, respect, kindness, love, trust, everyone's equal, right? So let's dive into a little bit more on how what I was talking about last week with regards to redlining, and how certain areas were actually really, really manipulated, and how certain areas, and this is all true stuff. This is all stuff that is, completely documented. It's new, but it's kind of new for a lot of us that didn't even think that this was even a issue, right? So the last week I spoke about, again, The Color of Law, the book. It's a great book. There's a lot of other information too out on YouTube as well, with Richard Rothstein talks about, these topics, and he breaks it down really, really well, but just talked about what happens when, the federal government came in. There were certain even FHA areas and builders that had built these areas, and the only way that they could, get these bids was not to sell to African-American families. And that was documented, and that is actually what happened. What had changed over the time, though, is, different things happened with working and different jobs that were taken, and the different industries that changed. And so what ended up happening is that public housing in these areas, and people wonder like, well, how did these areas become projects? How did they become kind of run down? Well, this is how. Public housing, it began in this country for civilians during the New Deal, and it was an attempt to address a housing shortage. It wasn't a welfare program for poor people during the Depression. There was actually no housing construction that was going on. So middle-class families and working-class families were losing their homes during the Depression when they became unemployed. And so there were many unemployed, middle-class, working-class white families. And this was the constituency of the federal government was most interested in, okay, so at the time. And so the federal government, they began, program of building public housing, and they literally labeled it as whites only in cities across the country. The liberal instinct of some Roosevelt administration officials, they led them to build some projects for African Americans as well, but they were always separate projects. They were never integrated. Interesting, right? Even in the, confounds of government, people probably wanting to be mixed in with each other, the government has separated it, right? So you had white projects, they had a large number of vacancies, and then black projects had a long waiting list, okay? So eventually it became obvious, that the public housing, the authorities and the federal government, they opened up the white designated projects for African Americans, and they filled them with African Americans. But at the same time, industry, like I was saying, industry was leaving the cities. African Americans were becoming poorer in those areas. The projects became projects for poor people, not for working class people. Interesting. It started off one way, it's shifted to another. So these housings, they became subsidized, and they hadn't been subsidized before. And so they became pretty much slums that we came to associate with public housing, because no one was maintaining those houses and no one was maintaining those properties. So the vacancies in the white projects were created primarily by the Federal Housing Administration Program, or FHA program, to suburbanize America. And the Federal Housing Administration subsidized mass production builders to create subdivisions that were white only, and they subsidized the families who were living in the white housing projects, as well as whites who were living elsewhere in the central city, to move out of the central cities and into these suburbs. So is how interesting it was with the Federal Housing Administration. They depopulated, the public housing of, families that are non-Black, while the public housing authorities were charged with the responsibility of housing African Americans who were increasingly too poor to pay for the full cost of their rent. So there you have it. That's one of the ways in which you see, areas that they call, projects had happened. But to bring it back a little bit more to home, I came across this piece of information, and and upon reading it, I'm like, wow, it actually gives a little bit of an example of some of the things that have happened, and it breaks it down by year. And I thought I'd like to share that because it's a good thing, because it actually drives it home to over here in the Bay Area, in certain areas in California, for instance, right? And like in Menlo Park, there were certain zoning maps that were very, really obvious on how things were set up and how things were segregated. Because, we think in I believe it was 1899, the country's first zoning law established to regulate building heights in DC. So this is in Washington, DC. So zoning is initially used to create safe, habitable communities, but sometimes it becomes a tool to segregate neighborhoods. And this is in 1899. By race and immigration status. So again, that was one thing that was talked about in The Color of Law, Forgotten History of How Our Government Segregated America. But this was in 1899. In 1917, the Supreme Court rules that housing segregation is unconstitutional. So we talked about that, right? it's unconstitutional, 1917, shouldn't happen anymore. But it's really interesting. In 1921 to 1926, especially in 1921, Los Angeles is one of the first cities to pass single-family zoning laws, which were upheld by the Supreme Court in 1926. The majority opinion describes apartments as encroaching like parasites until finally the residential character of the neighborhood and its desirability as a place of detached residences are utterly destroyed. So ultimately, even now that we find if a home is by apartment buildings and such, it's already kind of said that the value of the home goes down because of apartment buildings, which is interesting. So they were trying to kind of get away from that and say, okay, well, we're going to zone this. So things that are away from the apartments, those are the higher price homes or the better communities or neighborhoods. But those things that are by apartments, those ones, the value is going to be less. Well, we kind of see that now even in real estate. That's one of the things that people say if you're by a freeway or if you are by an apartment building, the desirability of the property and the home goes down. So interesting that things that were done in the 1900s, 1920s, I as a realtor, I hear these things, and these things are commonplace and commonly said in my profession. And so it's interesting to see where it started. But when I come back, we're going to talk even more about the timelines. We're going to go to the 1920s and 1934s up until now, and focus in on an area, Belhaven, right in our backyard in this area. And I think some of you guys will find this information in the time on the events kind of useful. So stay tuned. Tamika Ellsworth. Hey, I'm equipping people of faith for the home buying process. Thank you so much. We'll return in a second. All right, back again for the second half. I'm actually having fun in this series with regards to redlining, and giving people information that they may not have known. It's almost like, did you know? But to continue on with what I was talking about. So in the 1920s to 1940s, neighborhood covenants included white-only provisions with exceptions for servants. Did you know that? So in 1920s to 1940s, and they're literally, it's called CC&Rs, which are covenants, codes, and restrictions. And I had talked about this in the last one where a family had looked at their CC&Rs and saw, wait, whoa, there was race restriction on it. And it literally read that, that no person of African, Japanese, Chinese, or Mongolian descent shall use or occupy such property or any part thereof unless such person or persons are employed as servants by a Caucasian occupant of some portion of such property. Interesting. And this was in Menlo Park. And they, I have different clips and newspaper cutouts that support that. Interesting, right? But this is our history. So, it's as funky as it is, it's still the truth. So in 1934, the National Housing Act, and we talked a little bit about this too, creates the Federal Housing Administration, which is the FHA. And we talked about it operates various loan insurance programs, spurring a dramatic uptick in home ownership, but only for some. So neighborhoods are classified in part based on the threat, and this is what they've said, this is actually in the paperwork, but neighborhoods are classified in part based on the threat of infiltration of foreign-born, Negro, or lower grade population. No joke. The FHA uses redlining maps to deny mortgages to families seeking homes in non-racially harmonious communities. And it literally had it on the paperwork that it did in 1934. And there was an exhibit presented by Ella Ellsworth to the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights in 1960 that talked about this paperwork and how it was actually written into the actual handbook of the FHA, right? Again, governmental declarations, right? So 1940 to 1944, Black Americans migrated from the South to San Francisco, Oakland, and Richmond to contribute to the wartime naval and, the wartime naval and industry boom. And so, which is great, laborers were wanting work. There was a big boom inside of that, right? But in 1944, the GI Bill provided low interest home mortgages to soldiers returning from World War I. So this is 1944. So Black veterans, they don't benefit. They didn't benefit from this GI Bill. Buyers in integrated neighborhoods don't qualify for federal home loans, which is really interesting. You serve your country, you come back, you think you have a GI Bill in order to get a home, and they say no. Because in Menlo Park, believe it or not, Black veterans were unable to purchase homes in white-only neighborhoods. And it's documented as well. And they were excluded completely out of the area for white tracts, which is interesting that, you know, you serve your country, however you come back, and you're still not able to have home ownership, right? But things do get better. In 1946 to 1953, suburban housing developments, they boom, but they exclude Black Americans because builders who try to develop integrated communities cannot obtain federally insured financing. So again, this is the FHA kind of coming in and saying, no, yes, you can do the housing tracts, but you have to restrict who you are able to, who's able to purchase these homes. And so in Menlo Park, developers build Belle Haven as a predominantly white middle-class suburb, which is interesting because if you know Belle Haven, at one point it was one way, but now the whole face of it has changed a whole lot. So in 1948, the Supreme Court strikes down racially restrictive housing covenants. Yay, right? Holding that the 14th Amendment Equal Protection Clause prohibits their enforcement. And so like there's literally newspaper, headlines, Cal Negroes can now live anywhere, says the High Court, which is really interesting. But however, FHA loans are limited to racially harmonious communities, so non-white home buyers do not benefit from these low interest federally insured loans. So yeah, they said that you can now live anywhere. However, in these housing suburbs, you can't. Other places you can, hence redlining, but in these areas, which are the new suburbs, you cannot. Interesting. So the city, and this is in 1949, the city of Menlo Park annexes Suburban Park and Belle Haven, okay? So basically they separate them. At the time, Belle Haven is among the most affluent neighborhoods between 101 and the Bay, as residents are majority white working class. And you can see, they showed pictures of the Belle Haven, graduating class in like 1852, and it's kind of interesting, the 8th grade pictures. But in 1952, Menlo Park's master plan consultant proposes increasing lot sizes. So it states the minimum lot size increase is to protect what we've got. There are no reasons why slums or blighted areas should ever exist in Menlo Park. So they develop a master plan in order to separate certain areas that would be considered kind of inferior areas, right? And so hence, and you can see this to this day, and I hinted at it before, you see it to this day where there's a big, where 101 drives in, right? So 1950 to 1958, Highway 101 is widened, creating a barrier between neighborhoods. The NAACP later calls this roadway the concrete curtain. And so they show a picture of Bayshore Highway in 1950, and then it's even more increased in 1958, and then they developed the overpass. So those of you that know those areas, you know that on the Belle Haven side, for instance, of Menlo Park, home prices are at least 100,000, less than on the other side of the opposite side of Belle Haven that splits the area. So 1955 to 1960s, real estate agents target Black home buyers in San Francisco, Oakland, and Richmond to purchase homes in Belle Haven. So now they're kind of bringing it over, but it's interesting because they target out specific ethnicities in order to, inhabit these areas. And 1955 to the 1960s, as Black families moved into Belle Haven, realtors convinced white neighbors to panic sell, then resell the homes at higher prices to Black families. And this is called block busting. And this is one of the things that the Fair Housing Act had passed so that these things can't be done. But it was done, and it was done considerably. And actually so much so, they have news articles and paper articles that actually talk about this happening in the 1960s. So in 1955 also, an integrated group of Belle Haven residents attempts to stop block busting. So there's people that actually, like neighborhood associations, that come through in our backyard, basically saying, no, this is not right. And you shouldn't live like this. You shouldn't be able to block bust. You shouldn't have to sell higher to Black families than you would to anyone else. And so in 1957, the NAACP, the Crisis magazine, publishes an article about the dispute over new school district boundaries that create mostly Black high school, Ravenswood, and mostly white high school, Menlo Atherton. Interesting, we see this to this day on how the breakup is in these particular areas. Despite pushback from Belle Haven and East Palo Alto residents, a a board member defends the move, saying this would be putting our noses in something that does not concern us. Ultimately, they didn't have anything to do with it. But it was something that Taria Hall Pittman in 1960, she was the NAACP acting regional secretary. She testified to the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights about real estate practices that prevent non-whites from purchasing homes anywhere in Menlo Park but in Belhaven. And she made a big summary of her findings, and that was kind of a huge case that had happened in that area. And when she was giving the testimony, and again, this is in 1960, during her testimony to the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights about discriminatory housing practice in Menlo Park, she also described the effects that it had on local schools, which is interesting. So she kind of brought all this evidence and information, even on the pattern of segregation that were happening into those areas. Fast forward, 1968, the Fair Housing Act forbids individual acts of explicit racial discrimination. So this is where we come in with the Fair Housing Act, because all of these things were happening, again, in our backyard to make sure that, you know, areas were segregated. But thank goodness that certain laws were now starting to pass to change those things. And so 1975, 1976, Menlo Park School District annexes Suburban Park and Menlo Oaks, both majority whites and previously part of the Ravenswood Elementary School District. So now they separate it. So Ravenswood has their thing, and you can, you know, it's night and day, those school districts and such, even to this day. 1976, a group of Ravenswood parents, they filed a lawsuit contending that the isolation of minorities in their neighborhoods, that it leads to unequal educational opportunities. The lawsuit was settled in 1986 with an agreement that, you know, the schools, they could transfer to other schools, which is great. When you speak up about different injustices in areas in order to make it right, it takes a little time, but usually it's able to happen. What's interesting, 1983, and to kind of like sum it up, Ravenswood and Flood neighborhoods transfer from Ravenswood Elementary School District to Menlo Park School District. In their unsuccessful appeal of the decision, the Ravenswood School District argues that the proposed transfer will isolate many students in the Ravenswood School District, and where it would be hard to integrate the schools. They said that while surrounding them with overwhelming white districts, it's still not filled with those type of individuals. And so therefore you don't have any integration of those schools, therefore still rendering these school districts poorer than the others. And which a lot of those effects you can kind of find now, even when you look at the whole breakdown of like Menlo Atherton versus just the Belhaven districts. And so I'm going to pause here because there's actually more things to talk about in this area, and where the breakdown actually comes even more with regards to the community and the Belhaven residents. Now, in talking about it later, okay, you have Facebook that's come in. There's a lot of things that are happening in the area, so that's changed the face. And so on my next episode, I'll talk more about, how then, and then talk about the 2000s and up until now and what's happening and what's going to happen in the future. And so we'll be able to see the progression of how laws have changed for the better, but you still see some of the effects that have happened based off of redlining and just things that were dividing people. But I really appreciate you taking the time, and hopefully you can join me for the next episode, and I'll break down some things and actually give some examples of steering in my industry and things that people have been needing to stay away from. So I thank you so much. This is Tamika Ellsworth, Faith in Homebuying, and I'm equipping people of faith with the home buying process. Thank you, and God bless.